Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the libraries today for this STEAM Salon with SoRelle Wyckoff Gaynor. Her presentation is entitled Reallocating Representation. My name is Jody Coulter. I am the Life Sciences and Outreach Librarian. I'm located normally in the STEM library. Today I'm in McKeldin, and we are so happy to have SoRelle with us today. There are just a couple of notes before we get started. First of all, we are recording this just so that you're aware, so that we can have a recording of it up on our website later. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. We're super happy to take a look at that at the end. And this is our land acknowledgement. At the UMD libraries, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those who have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. We acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of this Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. And before we jump in, I did want to send out a reminder that our next STEAM Salon is April 6th with Shuo Jim Huang, the intersection of race and place matters. It will be virtual, just like this one is today. And we are always looking for STEAM Salon proposals. We invite UMD faculty and students to submit proposals and nominations for STEAM Salons through the UMD Research Commons website. We're always looking for folks, and we really love having new and upcoming researchers and showcasing their work. The salon format is pretty informal. we like to have presentations at the beginning and then take questions from attendees. And we try to have folks from all over campus coming to our STEAM salons because we do like the interdisciplinary format. And as I mentioned, STEAM salons are recorded and made available not on the Research Commons, but on the library website page. Okay, so today, our STEAM Salon is with SoRelle Wyckoff Gaynor, Reallocating Representation. SoRelle Wyckoff Gaynor is a PhD candidate of American politics and political methodology at the University of Maryland College Park. Her primary research interests include committee and congressional leadership, the budget and appropriations process, and public policy. In 2019 to 2021, SoRelle served as an APSA Public Service Fellow for the U.S. House Select Committee on Modernization of Congress, which I had to look up, didn't know that was a thing. In the fall of 2022, she will join the Political Science Department at College of the Holy Cross as an assistant professor. Congratulations to you, SoRelle, on that. I am going to hand this over to you now.
Awesome, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited for this talk. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right, so this talk will present some new and existing research on the reapportionment and redistricting process in the United States. These two processes are key steps in how congressional seats for the U.S. House of Representatives are determined. My research finds that at both of these stages, at reapportionment and redistricting, certain demographic and economic groups are particularly vulnerable to see their representation in Congress changed or diminished. So for this talk, I can move the next slide. For this talk, I'll first provide an overview of how the reapportionment and redistricting process works, and then I'll look at the published findings on trends in reapportionment from 1960 to 2010, and then I'll present some new research, which is the historical trends in redistricting from the same time period. Building off of these findings, I'll consider what we might expect to see in 2022. We're in a current redistricting period right now. And I'll conclude with some alternative possibilities for how our redistricting process could work in the future. And like Jody said, I'll conclude with Q&A. So I'll answer any that are dropped in the chat at the end. So one of the great constitutional compromises was bicameralism. That's the creation of two separate chambers of Congress with two separate measures of representation. This compromise is still in effect today. In the Senate, each state has 2 senators regardless of population. Highly populous states like California and Texas are going to have the same amount of senators as low population states like Vermont or North Dakota. In the House, however, representation is based on state population. The larger a state's population, the more congressional seats that they have. Today, California has the largest state delegation, followed by Texas, Florida, and New York. However, because population among states change over time, people move internally between states, birth rates exceed death rates over time, new immigrants will make their home in these states. How the seats are actually distributed in the US House must be reallocated every few years. This is the reapportionment and redistricting process. Every 10 years, the US Census captures changes in demographics that just occurred in 2020. And then per Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, following the census, reapportionment is calculated at the federal level, which tells each state how many congressional seats they have to work with. After a state is allocated a number of congressional seats, mapmakers at the state level will meet to draw their new districts. This is the redistricting process. Once the maps are agreed upon, they're implemented in election years ending in 2. So that would be this year, 2022. So currently we're at the redistricting and implementation stage. The upcoming midterm elections in November 2022 will be the first time that new maps from the 2020 census are implemented. Several maps are currently being challenged in the courts. Here's some headlines from these events, but we should expect that to wind down soon because states, candidates, and constituents need to have ample time to prepare for their elections. But as these headlines indicate, it's a contentious and a complicated process. So how does it actually work and which citizens is it most likely to affect? First, let's look at how reapportionment works. A key feature of reapportionment is the limited number of seats that the entire US population has to work with. Since 1913, the number of representatives in the House of Representatives has been fixed at 435. But as we can see in Figure 1, while the number of seats in the US House has stayed the same, the US population continues to grow. So every year, each congressional district population is going to be larger than the year prior and so on. However, some areas and some states will experience faster growth than others. But because the law requires that congressional districts be equal in size across the country, reapportionment calculates the number of congressional seats so that each state has the same amount of people in each district. As a result, during the reapportionment process, some states will gain or lose seats. I call these dynamic states, while states that remain unchanged are static states. How seat count is determined is actually a surprisingly simple formula. First, every state starts with 1 seat. You have to have 1 representative, and DC is included in this list as well. But these are your low population states: Alaska, Vermont, the Dakotas. The remaining 385 seats are doled out based on the priority ranking of each state's population, P. So essentially all you're doing is you're multiplying the population of the state times the divisor of the seat number that you're on. This formula is called the Huntington-Hill method, and it's been in place since the 1930s after it was developed by 2 mathematicians. But as you go up in seat count, the threshold for retaining a seat is higher because the higher the divisor, the smaller the decimal that you're multiplying the state population by. So larger states have to have exponentially larger populations to continually gain seats. So because the US population is always growing as a whole, the rates of growth in individual states matter immensely. So here it is in practice using 2 states from our data set. In 2010, Pennsylvania lost a seat while Georgia gained 1, even though Pennsylvania has a much larger population than Georgia. However, by multiplying the Pennsylvania population by the exponent of 19, which is how many seats it had prior to 2010, it receives a lower priority ranking here in red, than Georgia's new 14th district. In short, Pennsylvania did not grow at as fast a rate as Georgia or other states, and it was not able to maintain all 19 of its congressional districts. So now let's turn to what happens after reapportionment, the redistricting process. So after reapportionment, the census and the federal government tells each state how many congressional seats they are given. This is where the process then heads down to the state level. Each state gets to choose how they want to draw their maps, and each state has different institutions responsible for this task. During this process, all states, dynamic or static, will take advantage of the redistricting period to draw new maps. So while the changes motivated by losing or gaining a seat are unavoidable, redistricting gives all states a chance to tinker with their congressional boundaries. There are three types of redistricting institutions. There are legislatures, which can be unified under one party, or they can be split by divided by party. There are commissions, which can be bipartisan, which mean they make up partisan members from both sides, or they can be nonpartisan, meaning they have non-party affiliated experts and community members. Or in cases when legislatures or commissions fail to come to an agreement, the courts will step in and have the final say in redistricting. Because there is a deadline, right? We have to have an election, so the map must be in place. So sometimes the courts will step in and make the decisions for everyone. And sometimes states will require that the governor sign off as well. However, it's clear and it's important to clarify that redistricting is not the same thing as gerrymandering. Rather, gerrymandering is a response to redistricting. Gerrymandering is the purposeful manipulation of boundaries during a redistricting period. Here's an example of a Republican-friendly gerrymander. Let's say you have a state with 4 congressional districts, but an evenly divided electorate. You could divide it this way to dilute the vote of Democratic voters by packing them into one district, this blue one in the center, giving Republicans an advantage in 3 out of the 4 districts. Here's the same hypothetical state that more evenly divides the districts, giving each party a relatively safe one and then 2 more toss-up seats in the state. So to reiterate, gerrymandering is not the same thing as redistricting, although people often use the terms interchangeably. Rather, gerrymandering is a purposeful manipulation during the redistricting process. So let's look at an example from 2010 to understand how the reapportionment process plays out from start to finish. So this is Pennsylvania in 2010. The census occurs like it does every 10 years. During this reapportionment period, as I showed from the example earlier, Pennsylvania lost a seat during their reapportionment process. They didn't grow at as fast a rate as other states in the US. The area of slowest growth was in the Pittsburgh area, which is right over here. This is where the state legislature focused their efforts. However, when one district is removed, it's not as simple as just removing it. There's a ripple effect throughout the state. The 550,000 people that were in that Pittsburgh district at the time need to be absorbed into surrounding areas. And then that kind of creates a ripple effect for the rest of the congressional districts throughout the state. So state legislatures have a significant leeway in how they get to draw this new map. In 2010, the Pennsylvania legislature was GOP controlled, and they implemented a new map in 2012 that put 2 Democratic incumbents against each other as surrounding districts became more solidly Republican. So this is an example of a partisan gerrymandered, and it's kind of a standard one for redistricting in the US. It focuses on partisan gains and losses. However, there are widely impactful and understudied changes that make reapportionment and redistricting period more of an issue for certain demographic groups. Because reapportionment inherently impacts low growth and high growth areas, and redistricting introduces opportunities for institutions to shift the population to their advantage, certain demographics are more likely to be affected during the reapportionment and redistricting stage. In particular, this research focuses on minorities and the economically vulnerable. So let's look at trends in the reapportionment and districting process from history so we can gather which constituents are more likely to be shifted around and how it will ultimately affect the quality of representation they receive. So first, let's look at the reapportionment stage. This is a sample from our data set. The seats in red were cut in 2010. These were seats that previously existed, but then didn't meet the reapportionment threshold. And the seats in greens were the ones that were the final 10. They were either added if they have an asterisk or they were maintained. For states that lost a seat in the red, my co-author, Jim Gimple, and I, he's a professor in the Government and Politics Department, we take the slowest growth district in that state at the time, and for the states that gained a seat in green, we pull the fastest growing congressional district in that state at the time. We consider those as pressure points of low growth and high growth. We then examine the demographics of these two groups, the high and low growth districts, across all reapportionment from 1960 to 2010. So here's what the dynamic states that gained or lost a seat, look like over time. The green districts are those of high growth, and the gray areas are those of low growth that were ultimately abolished. There are some clear trends. Growth is consistent in the Sun Belt and the Southwest part of the United States. Conversely, decline is pretty consistent in the Rust Belt, Midwest, and upstate New York areas. So we go on to evaluate the demographic details of each of these districts. And to do that, we performed F-tests to evaluate the difference of means between the districts that changed, lost or gained, or remained the same. We found that high growth areas have a higher percentage of foreign-born constituents. That probably makes sense to most of us. And they also have high rates of construction jobs, as new homes and buildings are going to inherently follow new populations or population booms. In the low growth districts, we found, interestingly, a higher percentage of manufacturing jobs, a higher percentage of elderly and Black constituents. So we then considered, what are the political implications of these trends? After controlling for density, we found that Democratic held seats are 11% more likely to be abolished than Republican held seats. This was particularly true for 2010, for 2000 and 2010, these last bottom right squares right here. These areas of decline present particular challenges for Democratic representatives. While the Rust Belt was once an area of strong unions and strong Democratic support, it has now become a source of strong support for Trump's populist message. So I contend that this consistent decline of this demographic of this region is part of the draw of Trump's outsider and populist message. However, reapportionment is just the first step in this process. While these districts are not directly removed or added, because again, you have to either absorb or carve out from existing districts, they do give us some information about internal migration and demographic patterns that will influence the redistricting process. So considering our Pennsylvania example from earlier, the state legislature had a few options on how they wanted to absorb that lost congressional district in 2010. They ultimately had a partisan motivation to pit two Democratic incumbents against each other. But not all redistricting institutions are going to behave that way. While it's easy to think, why not just make districts dense and compact, as illustrated to the map on the right side. Look how small and clean these district lines are. But in reality, there are many considerations that map makers must make. There are the political considerations, as exampled through Pennsylvania. There's also considerations for incumbent lawmakers that people want to protect, make sure they get maintain their election. But map makers also take into consideration features of congressional districts. They don't want to break up neighborhoods or school districts. Large industries or farms should stay together, and maybe there's a river or a bridge or some other type of territory that must be considered in the map making process. And lastly, there are a few legal considerations, most notably the Voting Rights Act, which prevents minority voting power from being purposefully diluted. So map makers must be careful to avoid triggering this legal requirement. So who's drawing these maps over the course of our data set? Because the Constitution allocates the responsibility of map drawing to the state, states get to pick and choose which institution they want to use, and this changes over time. So this figure shows how institutions have changed over the course of our data set. Commissions have grown in popularity. Democratic-controlled legislatures have declined in prevalence while Republican-controlled legislatures have grown. And federal and state courts are a pretty consistent final litigator. So, turning to our research, how do institutions impact representation? To answer this, I compare populations in congressional districts prior to the new map with districts after a new map is implemented. So while everyone in a state is eventually placed into a congressional district, even the slightest tweak of a border can impact thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people. So this approach captures which populations are more likely to be shifted around. It tells us the net change of population in a district, and we're going to compare this to average change throughout the state. In other words, if one demographic is moved at a higher rate than other demographics, this should indicate a purposeful shifting by the institution. Unfortunately, this approach does not tell us which directions groups are moved in or out of a district, so we can only hypothesize about the reasoning. But because we use state and year fixed effects and cluster out our standard errors by state, we know that what we're observing is the result of the redistricting institution. So given what we know about the reapportionment process, I assume that some political institutions, particularly partisan legislatures, are going to be more likely to use the redistricting process as an opportunity to develop favorable maps to them. And I also expect that certain groups will be seen as politically valuable, like minority populations, while others might be seen as expendable, like low-income voters. So, which institutions are more likely to impact the population? Among all constituents, as expected, partisan legislatures are the most likely to move large chunks of populations in and out of districts. They're going to have the most the biggest change in congressional district lines. Among minority constituents, partisan legislatures are the most likely to shift foreign-born populations, but interestingly, Black voters were unlikely to be moved by any institution. And among the economically vulnerable, the GOP and split legislatures are more likely to shift around blue-collar workers, while Democratic legislatures will focus on the unemployed. I also found that institutions behave differently under static and dynamic redistricting environments. I divided districts into states that were static, no congressional seats were added or lost, and those that were dynamic. First, looking at minority groups, while partisan legislatures are the most likely to move populations, as we expected, foreign-born populations were particularly likely to be moved in a dynamic environment. Again, these are the populations in a high-growth area, and both Democratic and Republican members of Congress have shown their proclivity to win this sector's vote. They seem to remain untouched in a static setting, though. The lack of statistically significant movement for Black voters is also particularly noteworthy, given that areas of high Black populations are some of the most at-risk areas for congressional seat removal. This likely indicates that different institutions want to maintain an existing congressional district, either for a bond that they have with the representative or for the sake of maintaining a minority majority district. So turning to the economically vulnerable, given that both of these economic indicators are increasingly correlated with population decline, the changes in population for blue-collar workers under a static environment is particularly notable. GOP-run legislatures and split legislatures are more likely to shift these populations even when a new map is not inherently necessary. And when federal courts step in to adjudicate map discrepancies, this population again sees a greater likelihood of movement. Likewise, the unemployed are more likely to be shifted in a static state by Democratic legislatures, and in a dynamic setting, split legislatures are the most likely to impact blue-collar workers, ultimately lowering their representational impact and dispersing them elsewhere in the state. This historical data gives us some indication about how 2022 will play out. So first, looking at the reapportionment process, this has already occurred. The 2020 census has been concluded, and we know which states are gaining or losing seats. So in this map, the green states are gaining seats, and some of them are gaining several seats, like Texas and Florida. And we see this continued growth in the Sun Belt in the South, as well as the Mountain West. The gray seats are the seats that are states that are losing a seat. And again, we see similar trends. The Rust Belt, the Midwest, and upstate New York are losing seats. Interestingly, While California remains the most populous state in the union, this is the first year ever that it's losing a congressional district. Essentially, it did not grow at as fast a rate as Texas, Florida, or North Carolina. As for the institutions in charge of redistricting, we see some continued trends from the past few decades here as well. GOP legislatures are maintaining their dominance, particularly in the South, which are, of course, the dynamic states. Conversely, Democratic legislatures have handed much of their power over to the nonpartisan or bipartisan commission. These are the states in green. While this has positive implications for objective map making, it could potentially hinder Democratic gains who are unmatched by aggressive Republican legislatures. So given these trends and what we know about historical apportionment and redistricting, these are my personal expectations. The high growth of foreign-born populations in the South alongside GOP legislature control will lead to gerrymandered minority districts. Foreign-born populations in particular should expect to see their district boundaries change. This is further compounded by the removal of the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance requirement from Southern states, which essentially just means that Southern states or states with a history of racial gerrymandering no longer need to get their maps approved at the federal level. There's been some indication from the courts that the weight of the Voting Rights Act is waning. While the Texas legislature's map was sued because their map dilutes powers of minority, the Supreme Court recently ruled that a racially gerrymandered map was actually based on political lean, not minority population. As for the economically disadvantaged populations, while they might be more likely to see their representation change, they also present a new potential base for the Republican Party. Blue collar Rust Belt area, this used to be a stronghold of the Democratic Party, but now this is the elusive Obama-Trump voter, and they seem to be firmly Republican over the course of the last 10 years, given the ideological shifting along other issues. So we might see Republican legislatures or even Democratic legislatures move these groups around to their advantage. Lastly, the tremendous loss of population from COVID will ultimately play a role in redistricting, but we won't see the full effect until the 2030 census. There's reason to expect that areas hit particularly hard could be more likely to lose seats in the reapportionment stage, particularly as COVID continues. So beyond the partisan gains or losses, this has larger implications for the quality of representation for historically oppressed groups. First, at the most basic level, changes to congressional districts make it harder to vote. Political science has found that the higher the cost or difficulty of voting, the less likely an individual is to actually show up and vote. So when your district border changes, your congressional district number changes, your representative's name changes, or maybe even your polling place moves. These are all significant costs that really turn off a lot of voters. But at a deeper level, it impairs the relationship between constituents and representative. When you or your demographic group is more likely to have their representation changed every 10 years, you're unlikely to maintain a priority status for your member of Congress. Let's say you begin in a district where your industry or your demographic group represents 60% or even 30%. You can assume that your needs are going to be important to that representative. However, if you're split up or you move to a new district where you only are 10% of the district, you're less likely to matter or less likely to have an existing relationship with that member of Congress. Conversely, if you're packed into one district, despite being a majority of the state, you're going to lose power throughout Congress as a whole. And this is what we're seeing in Alabama. Despite Black voters being over 25% of the population, they're all packed into one congressional district, meaning that only 1 out of 7 of Alabama's congressional seats is represented by a Black legislature or a Democrat. And for all Americans, given that the population of the United States continues to rise, but the number of members of Congress stays the same, we're all losing quality of representation to some degree. So, but just as the apportionment process evolved in the 1900s, there are some alternatives that are being considered by political scientists and community advocates. First, there are reapportionment alternatives, most notably raising the number of seats in Congress to grow with the population. So while it sounds far-fetched, this has happened before. It does maintain that each district needs to retain equal numbers. The current congressional district has about 750,000 people in it, though. That's a lot for one individual to represent. So the pros of this approach is that it would improve individual representation. It would make constituent services higher quality and actually pair the population to each district of that of the smallest one, which is currently the state of Vermont. Cons are that this could potentially make Congress more gridlocked because there'd be more cooks in the kitchen. However, it could also introduce greater ideological variation, potentially greasing the wheels of bipartisanship. There are also several redistricting alternatives. One is to require commissions for all states. Another alternative is to revert to the voting rights review process for all states to ensure minority right to vote is protected. And lastly, measures of compactness could also be required for districts. It's hard to say how successful these would be because the Constitution does grant states the right to choose how they want to redistrict. So there's potential that any federal change would require a amendment to the Constitution, and there's not really a political appetite for that right now. But perhaps more compelling are reforms in how representation is selected altogether. There's a strong grassroots movement to consider multi-member districts for congressional elections. So currently, if an individual wins 50.001% of a district, they're going to win control of the entire district. Multi-member districts would give each district several representatives that reflect the proportion of the voting outcomes. This is common in other democracies, particularly for lower chambers or House of Representatives equivalent. It also has an added bonus of making it easier for third-party candidates to be elected, something that would likely decrease the high levels of partisanship in Congress today. And because the Constitution does allocate responsibility of elections to the state, this is something that could be reformed at a state level. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I will throw a link in the chat during the Q&A. Lastly, there are some individual level things that we can do. We can educate ourselves and others about the reapportionment process in our state. It is very confusing, and partially this is on purpose, right? So we can do our best to educate ourselves and others. We can also make sure that we are up to date on our voter registration, particularly years ending in 2. So that would be this year. So make sure to check your current status, make sure you're registered for the right places. And then if you do want to advocate for some change, you want to make your voice heard at the state level, directed to state representatives, and support grassroots efforts like proportional representation. So in conclusion, reapportionment and redistricting affect certain populations more than others. We know this historically. Reapportionment is responsive to dynamic change in high growth states, so foreign-born populations and southern states, and low growth states, so blue collar, Black population, and Rust Belt states. Redistricting is going to be reliant on the state institution, but partisan legislatures do lead to larger shifts, particularly for low income and minority constituents. Even slight shifts have implications for the quality and consistency of representation that constituents receive. And as the House of Representatives stays the same size, concerns and challenges for the quality of representation will impact all Americans. But I will end on a positive note. Change is possible. America is always evolving by the very nature of how elections, our court system, and constitutional amendments were designed by the founding fathers. So thank you all again. And with that, I will open it up for Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for your presentation. It was awesome.
Thank you.
You definitely got some wonderful comments in the chat, so be sure to check those out. Some folks were very interested. We do have one question. Thanks, SoRelle. Which do you think is more likely, commissions being required for every state, DC and Puerto Rico becoming states, or abolishing the Electoral College? So you've got 3 choices there.
I think that is a great question. As much as I want to say that DC statehood, as a DC resident myself, I would really love some congressional representation, but I think it would require a constitutional amendment. So given just how polarized Congress is, I think commissions actually do have a good likelihood. You know, more and more people are paying attention to gerrymandering and issues of redistricting. So there is a lot of movement towards commissions, and I will make sure to also throw this group on multi-member districts into the chat, which is another interesting movement going on as well. But unfortunately, I don't see statehood happening anytime soon. But maybe I'll be wrong. I'd love to be wrong.
I hope you're wrong too, which sounds like I hope they do get states as well. And actually, we do have a question on the multiple membership alternative. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is actually what most democracies use for their lower houses, like what Mexico uses and Canada, so our neighbors use it. But essentially, you would have fewer districts in a state, but every district would have multiple representatives. So if you, let's take, the College Park area, for example, it would probably be like 60% Democratic outcome, 40% Republican. So you'd actually send, 3 Democrats to Congress and 2 Republicans, or a third party voter. So that's another really big benefit why other countries have third parties and 4th, 6th parties that we don't, is because we have a first past the post system, which basically says first person to 50% wins. And that's kind of why people have automatically gone into these 2 parties. So multi-member districts would make it easier for third parties. It also just would be more reflective of the actual partisan breakdown of a congressional district. How in a ballot would work on that is it differs by different countries, do it different ways, but most commonly is that you'd go to the polling place with your ballot and you would rank your preference of candidates or preference of parties. And so New York City does this for their elections, as well as some other states like cities like Columbus. Maine has experimented with it. So it does work, and it would be through ranking, and just, whoever has the most votes would move forward. But it would allow for multiple winners. So it's not so first to 50%, which is probably good for the toxicity of elections in general.
Yeah, for sure. I can't imagine that is very beneficial to our system at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and it forces people into 2 silos, right? If you're a third party, we've all become accustomed to just saying my vote's not going to count, so I got to vote for an R or a D. So this would give some people, maybe a candidate that they feel actually more connected to.
Definitely. Yeah, for sure. There was some talk in the chat a little bit earlier about the situation that's happening right now in Prince George's County, where, and I'm going to paraphrase from Antonia here, where the county judge just ruled that the redistricting map proposed by the county council after a redistricting commission created their district map. And the council tried to break up Vansville, a historically majority Black community. I did drop a link to the most recent article in the Diamondback. I'm curious what your opinion about that is. Have you been following that situation?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And what's interesting about it is that the judge seemed to strike it down because the commission acted unconstitutionally, not necessarily that their map was unconstitutional, but that they, for those who don't know, this commission kind of acted on their own, sort of secretly, and then using their majority advantage in the city council or the county council, passed it. And the judge struck it down on that fact, not the fact that it was a racial gerrymandering and diluted minority votes. So I do wonder if it had been passed, the correct way, if the judge would have struck it down. Probably, I would. That seems like a pretty clear case of like diluting minority power. How it's different than Alabama is that the Alabama lawyers argued that because Black voters usually vote Democratic, that they were actually just making a partisan gerrymander, which, the Supreme Court said, okay, the Supreme Court really just said, we don't have time to draw another map, and they didn't get into the full merits of that argument, but that has introduced sort of an interesting implications for future challenges of the Voting Rights Act. So I'd be interested to see how that plays out over time.
I think that would be like my follow-up question is how you expect the Supreme Court has leaned heavily over the most recent years. So I'm curious how you would expect the Supreme Court to rule on these types of things.
Yeah.
Or if they are, is there anything that they're considering right now, for example?
I'm not sure about current, their ruling in the Alabama case was just a stay, saying like, we'll deal with this later after the midterms because it's too close to the midterms to change maps, which maps are still being ironed out. So that's not entirely true. My guess is that this will be a challenge for Black voters because it is true that majority Black voters do vote Democratic. That has happened for a long time. That is not the case for Latino voters. Latino voters are much more split along like a 60-40 line. And so I think that, in the case of Texas, where they're being challenged for diluting the Latino vote, they cannot claim that partisan argument that the state of Alabama claimed. So I do think that, which is good because that is the fastest growing demographic in the United States right now. So I think that there's still going to be some weight with the Voting Rights Act. What will be interesting to see is if an update to the Voting Rights Act does pass Congress. Obviously, the most recent one was the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is stuck in the Senate like many things are. That is being held up not necessarily for its, the issues of racial gerrymandering. It's just more about the federal changes to the election, which, as I mentioned, has constitutional challenges. So I don't see that bill really moving forward, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was at least sort of a bipartisan renewed attention, maybe a smaller bill that kind of, both parties know that Latino voters are important to their success. And so it would be in their best interest to make sure that the Voting Rights Act is protects them. So it will remain to be seen. What's interesting about minority voters and redistricting process is that in the 90s, there was this big boom in purposefully making minority majority districts with the idea that it would definitely give them a vote in Congress or representation in Congress. And it has successfully pretty much, all but like 95% of my majority minority district, which just means that minorities are the majority of the population, are represented by that demographic legislature. So Black districts are represented by a Black legislature, Latino, and that has positive implications, obviously, for representation. So yeah, so there's there's a lot of gray area in what would actually trigger the Voting Rights Act. So I will be interested to see how it continues to evolve the next few years.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't even considered that. Oh yeah, if you have majority minority, is that what you said? Majority minority, it would actually increase diversity in some areas. So that's in representation. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, so that's a positive of it. Of course, the negative is that, now all of the minority voters are in one district. So they might not, they could possibly have, in the state of Alabama, they could have 2 representatives, but they're, all relegated to one district.
To one, yeah. Right.
So pros and cons.
That's true.
As always.
Definitely. We have another question here. How optimistic are you about preventing minority rule and representation? It seems so anti-democratic.
Minority rule,
I'm not sure. That's a good question. Whoever asked the question, if you'd like to.
Oh, do they mean rural states and the Republicans in the minority having control? Is that?
Yes, that is what they
Okay.
mean.
Okay. Well, it's challenging because the Senate is a super majoritarian institution, and just part of how the chamber is set up, it really does give the minority party a lot of power to obstruct. Not so much in the House, because you really only need half plus one to pass legislation, but the Senate, I do not see either party retaining 60 seats or higher for a while. The last time that was when Obama was in office. That's when the Affordable Care Act was passed with 60 Democrats. Um, I I do think that this is a new interesting issue that people are pointing out, rightly so, that rural states, small states that are traditionally Republican have a lot more power in the Senate per constituent. So if you think that California has 39 million people in it and they have 2 senators, so 39 million divided by 2 is much less power than Wyoming, which has 600,000 people per 2 senators. So people of Wyoming have much more representation in the Senate than the people of California. But that is the compromise of the founders. So it's hard for me to see anything other than hopeful that there's more motivation for bipartisanship. It's pretty toxic right now. I do not deny that. So maybe if there is a filibuster reform, which is something I'm also pretty skeptical of in the current environment, but otherwise we are a city folk, and East Coast people are kind of out of luck, I think.
Okay. And then we have another question here in chat. Why is the two-party system so ingrained in our democracy culture? Is it because current older representatives benefited from the system? It feels like it polarizes us so much and the problem is getting worse.
I agree. I do think that polarization is at an all-time high. I don't think it's hyperbolic to think that at all. I think that a lot of it does boil down to the fact that if you're not in one of the two parties, it's very hard to win an election in the United States. Polarization has gotten worse in the past, 2 decades in particular, because for a while, you could be a conservative who voted for Democrats or a liberal who voted for Republicans. There was a lot more ideological diversity. Now it's pretty sorted among social issues, demographic groups. So people have become, at the voter level, people have become much more ingrained. People have a personal tie to their party. And increasingly, they have actually more than just pride for their own party. They have a lot of disdain and hatred for the other party. It's called affective polarization. That's on the rise at the constituent level, and then at the elite level among lawmakers. One, they're aware of that, so it's in their best interest to really demonize the other side. But two, if they wanted to run for office, and Bernie Sanders and Angus King of Maine being, the exceptions, technically they are independents, but most voters go to the polling booth and they make their decisions based on whether there's an R or D by someone's name. And because you have to get 50%, 50.001% to win, it's just in their best interest to coalesce between one of the two parties. So there's a few things going on, but the polarization at the constituent level definitely encourages people at the elite level to maintain it and behave that way.
Excellent. I know there's a lot of research out there in terms of the psychology behind that as well.
Yeah.
It's kind of
a lot of people in the department and the government and politics department are doing great work. It's not my area of expertise, but there is Lily Mason, who was at Maryland, is now at Johns Hopkins. She has done a lot of great work on that. So for those who are interested in it.
Wonderful. Oh, and
Oh,
Antonia
nice.
says,
Yes. Perfect. It's a little depressing, but it is still interesting and good for us to know.
yeah, definitely. Beautiful. I want to take a moment and just ask if there are any other questions anybody has. You're also welcome to raise your hand. I'm super happy to unmute you, or drop questions in the chat. Some thanks in the chat for sure.
Oh, well, thank y'all. This has been, yeah, this has been great.
It can sometimes be a little bit hard to talk about, but I think you broke it down so pleasantly. It was like wonderful to like actually understand what was happening. So.
They do not make both how Congress operates, how elections operate. All of this is, I think, convoluted on purpose because it's easier for constituents to just go along with how it is because it's so hard to figure out. So I'm always happy to explain, and I love to learn about this stuff because even I'm like, what is going on?
That makes me feel comforted
Yes.
that the
Yeah,
expert also is like, what is going on?
Yes, like, wait.
Yeah.
Every court case that comes forward, I'm like, wait, what is this about? So it is, I think, confusing on purpose.
Yeah, definitely. For sure. Okay, well, I am going, yeah, yes. Yes, excellent. There's some more accolades in the chat, and congratulations on your upcoming assistant professorship.
Oh, thank you.
Wyckoff.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is wonderful for sure. Well, excellent. I will. I want to wrap this up. First of all, thank you so much to you, SoRelle, for being here. We really appreciate it. It was a wonderful talk. And thank you to everyone who participated and asked questions and joined us. And please consider joining us on April 6th as well for our next STEAM Salon. So thank you very much, SoRelle.